Good afternoon and good day, viewers. We are very happy to welcome you today to a new episode of South Asia Chat, the postcard series hosted by the Institute of South Asian Studies in the National University of Singapore. And we are delighted to have with us here today Mr. Stephen Olson. Steve, as he's normally known to all of us, is it's not just sufficient to say that he's an expert on trade policy issues. He has been dealing with trade policy and all matters related to trade in the United States, the multilateral domain, the Asian region, and various other parts of the world for nearly 5 decades now, if not more. Brings on the table a great wealth of experience and wisdom. And there's probably nobody better than Steve at this juncture to unpack what is happening in the world of trade since the assumption of office by Mr. Donald Trump in the White House for about more than 50 days now. So, Steve, thank you so much for being with us here today and welcome to the show.
Well, thanks, Amitendu, very much. It's a real pleasure to be here and especially a pleasure to have this conversation with you in person.
Thank you so much, Steve. Steve, and this was not totally unexpected, the kind of unilateral actions that we have seen being announced by President Trump. They were all kind of in the pipeline. He had made it very clear during his campaign that he's going to wield the tariff tool as powerfully as he can. And I think the first executive order that came out on the 20th of January itself, Make America First trade policy. That order kind of spelled out the whole story, that tariffs are going to be used as a tool, not just for correcting what he describes as economic imbalances that the US has with other trade partners, but also as a tool to secure foreign policy objectives and broadly serve national interests. And we have seen a flurry of orders that have come over the last 50 days or so. But there's a peculiar trajectory to these orders also. There's a kind of a start and stop motion that we are seeing. Tariffs are being announced and then paused, and then more tariffs are being mentioned of, spoken about, but not necessarily being announced. So all this appears to be some sort of a confused and perhaps not well thought of strategy, to some extent knee-jerk, to some extent ad hoc. And as somebody who has really lived in the world of trade policy, particularly in the US administration for so many years, would you like to take us through what is going on?
Sure. Well, I think you were probably a little bit generous in your description of your characterization of his approach to trade. I think it's been chaotic, and I think the chaos is a feature rather than a bug in his approach. Trump has made it clear that he views unpredictability as one of his greatest assets. So I think he's intentionally, I think the sort of zigzagging on again, off again nature of many of his tariff and other trade pronouncements reflect a desire to keep trade partners guessing, to keep them on the back foot and never quite knowing what's coming next. I think he thinks chaotic situations rebound to his benefit. The other important thing that I think you mentioned was that the trade actions that he's taking are not directed in response, strictly speaking, to trade issues. Typically, when a country applies punitive tariffs or takes punitive trade actions, it's in response to what it judges to be a violation of trade rules or unfair trade practices. Just take a quick review of some of the things that we've seen. The tariffs that were on again, off again, off again, on again with Mexico and Canada had absolutely nothing to do with trade issues. They were in response to fentanyl and immigration. We saw a 24-hour trade war with Colombia flare up and die down again, which was, again, not over trade, but over a dispute as to whether American military planes could be used to deport Colombian citizens. And of course, in this dialogue about Greenland, about Panama Canal, tariff threats are also dragged into that as well. So I think this reflects Trump's real everything's on the table approach to trade policy. He views tariffs, other punitive trade actions as a hammer he can use to sock countries on virtually any issue. Now, in terms of what this means for us more broadly, I think if Trump moves forward with even just a portion of what he's talking about, it could very well be the final nail in the coffin of the already significantly weakened global trade system. We've been in this 8-decade-long experiment where we're trying to make trade rules more comprehensive, we're trying to abide more stringently to trade rules, and we're moving to, and we've been progressively moving towards a decrease in tariff and non-tariff barriers. That is now completely out of the window if Trump moves forward on the basis that he's described. And I have to say that I think that this rules-based global trade system is one of these things in human life that we only miss when it's gone. We have a tendency to take it for granted, but if this system does collapse, does fade away, I think we're really gonna miss it at that point and realize its true value only when it disintegrates.
Steve, there is this feeling that when one looks at the Trumpian world of trade policy, that is something which you yourself and others have pointed out repeatedly, that it's no more a question of looking at countries as a bunch of a whole, but all trade relations are being looked at as exclusively binaries that are exclusive of each other. And looking at that particular worldview, there are 3 countries that we have seen till now which have been subjected to tariff actions. You mentioned Canada and Mexico, and of course China. There are countries with whom he has been negotiating differently. So, for example, with Japan, a particular trade deal has already been worked out. With India, a free trade agreement is in preparation. Perhaps something similar will happen with the United Kingdom as well. But if we look at the part of the world where we are having this conversation, and that is Southeast Asia, and also the greater Indo-Pacific region, which comprises a lot of these large Asian economies for whom the apprehensions are getting stronger and stronger as each week or day passes. So what kind of actions might come on them? Because there is also the threat of reciprocal tariffs. So how do you look at this situation panning out for, let us say, the Southeast Asian region, India, or maybe countries like Japan and Korea looking forward?
I think Southeast Asia is in a particularly vulnerable situation, and I say that for a couple of reasons. You start with the reciprocal tariffs that are scheduled to come into effect in early April. Many of the Southeast Asian countries do have significant tariff differentials with the United States. I'm thinking Vietnam in particular, and they're going to get hit hard there. But the important point that we need to keep in mind with the reciprocal tariffs is that it's really much more than reciprocal tariffs. The United States is not going to simply match the tariff level applied by other countries. They're also going to look at a whole host of non-tariff factors, subsidies, excessive regulations, exchange rates. So the quote-unquote reciprocal tariff could actually end up being significantly higher than the tariff rate a given country is applying on the United States. I think that's going to hit a number of countries in Southeast Asia very hard. The other issue that you've got is his day one executive order tasking his departments to look at countries that maintain trade surpluses with the United States and then provide recommendations. Now, we understand that the recommendations invariably will be some type of punitive trade action probably tariffs. So again, Vietnam is going to have a bullseye on its back there. It's got the largest trade surplus within Southeast Asia with the United States, but Indonesia, Malaysia, Thailand are also going to face some unwanted scrutiny there. And then the other point that I would make is that for reasons that are entirely understandable, the nations of Southeast Asia have been deeply integrated with China. It's been mutually beneficial, and it's perfectly sensible. But in the Trump White House, that integration with China will be viewed with a somewhat suspicious eye. The question will be, are these countries helping China intentionally or unintentionally circumvent either the tariffs that the United States has placed on those countries or some of the technology restrictions? And I think those countries could end up getting whacked there as well. Now, as if all that wasn't enough, keep in mind that the countries of Southeast Asia could find themselves with some headaches vis-a-vis China, because as the U.S. market continues to be closed off to Chinese exports, a lot of these products could end up in Southeast Asia being dumped at artificially low prices, thereby raising some antagonisms between the countries of Southeast Asia and China. The final point I'll make here, and I'm sorry for going on, but there's a lot to unpack here. The final point I'll make is that if in fact this rules-based global trade system is really going to be on the ropes, as I strongly believe it will be, that is going to hit the small trade-dependent countries of Southeast Asia especially hard, because when you look at the remarkable economic development trajectory of so many of these countries, it's really been dependent on globalization, deepening economic integration, and a reduction in trade barriers and an increase in abidance by trade rules. If that system really starts to fade away, that's going to be a particularly big problem for Southeast Asia.
I agree with your views, Steve, because I think there is a much larger issue at hand over here, that it's not just a question of Trump being unpredictable, which he truly is, or he being, just kind of out of bounds in many respects. There are systems and mechanisms which are a threat and which are being pulled apart through these very specific kind of disruptive steps. I mean, those could be deliberate on part of the Trumpian point of view, but it does have implications and ramifications. And in that note, I just wanted to ask you a little bit more specifically about India, because India and the US are interesting in terms of the larger space of things. They have been working closely with each other, and even if we look back at Trump 1.0, the threat of tariffs on India was pretty large at that point in time as well. But in spite of the tariff threat hanging high, India came very close to finalizing a bilateral trade agreement with the United States, which for perhaps some specific sensitive reasons could not be finalized during the last days of the Trump administration, and might have had also to do with the preoccupation with the COVID-19 pandemic at the time. But that process, the talk about a deal, is again pretty much in the works. And the joint statement that was issued by the two heads of states during Prime Minister Modi's visit to the United States talks about achieving this deal, at least the first phase of it, by the fall of 2025. So, which means it's pretty serious works in the pipeline. But while this deal is being worked out, parallelly, there are continuous utterances by President Trump and his people about how big a tariff imposer India is. So the latest is the press secretary coming out to indicate the fact that, bourbon whiskeys, for example, get slapped with huge tariffs, as does other. Now, I'm not exactly sure about the appetite for bourbon whiskey in India. That's a different question altogether. But how do you reconcile these two contradictory positions. On one hand, there is this strong engagement with India on the trade side. On the other hand, there is these noises that are going on. And what exactly does this mean as a strategy?
I think you're exactly right. I think India is a particularly interesting case. And I think there's a number of things that we can walk through that would suggest a strengthening, a warming in the relationship, and a number of things that we can unpack that could point us in the opposite direction. Now, look, one comment I'll make is these are very good times to be Narendra Modi. He's becoming increasingly popular with a lot of different people around the world for a variety of reasons. Trump, we understand, places a very high value on personal relationships, and all indications are that he's got a strong relationship with Prime Minister Modi. I think also India is extremely important from the U.S. and the EU perspective from that point of view, vis-a-vis the relationship with China. So I think all of that bodes very well. But at the same time, we cannot gloss over the fact that a number of aspects of India's trade regime must make Trump's blood pressure go through the roof. I mean, he complains about 10 and 15 and 20% tariffs. Trump is apoplectic about a 10% tariff that the EU maintains on U.S. autos. How does he feel about 150% tariffs on wine and things like that? So I think there's a bit of a push and a pull. I think there's a bit of a dichotomy. I think there's going to be a desire to smooth out the trade relationship with India. But by the same token, there's going to be some real issues here, the agricultural protectionism, etc. So I think there's going to be a desire to work out some type of a deal, but there's going to be some really strong stumbling points here, and it remains to be seen where exactly all of this is going to end up.
Steve, on that question, and this is not just about India, but generally in a broader perspective, we have seen a lot of action on tariffs in terms of the so-called engagement policy of the Trump administration. But do you sense that when it comes to countries like India or maybe UK or certain other countries of the world, there is a possibility that going forward, other issues which are not necessarily trade action oriented, perhaps issues of greater geoeconomic significance in terms of their strategic importance, might actually come to play a bigger role on the broad relationship between the two countries. So what I basically mean to say is that while tariffs are one part of the story, if we look at bilateral relationships between the United States and other countries in totality, such as with India, do you think that non-tariff and non-trade factors down the line might play a bigger role in taking forward that relationship?
I think it's possible, but I think we have to keep in mind Trump has got this real fixation on trade issues, and I think if you think about what are his primary priorities from the first day that he's walked in to the Oval Office, I think you have to say it's immigration and trade. And so the larger sort of geostrategic, geoeconomic chessboard, I think, is going to factor into his calculations. But I think he really wants to take some strong actions on trade. And in particular, in the case of India, where there are some very high tariffs and some other problems for U.S. businesses in accessing that market, I think there's going to be some real contretemps there.
I think I agree with you on that, Steve, because in a sense, if he has already taken the view that tariffs are going to be imposed and tweaked upon in national interest, and even as a foreign policy tool, I guess what you're saying makes a lot of sense. The final idea, Steve, on which I wanted your sort of thoughts on is that we are not yet 2 months into the Trump administration, and there's already, by his own admission to the interview that he gave on television, a couple of channels, the United States as a country, as an economy, is going to go through a period of transition, which I think is just, he's just stopping short of admitting that there are going to be some high costs, particularly for the domestic consumers. And the greater impact of that, as far as the rest of the world is concerned, is something that might even amount to, a southward plunge of economic sentiments and economic activities. So some people have already started using the word recession, which might be perhaps still now a bit of an anxious expression, but the markets haven't taken kindly to these tariff actions. There is a great amount of confusion among the short to medium term investors about how to go about parking their funds where. And global inflation is clearly on the rise. And I suppose this is only going to harden as we go further. So what do you think will eventually happen? Is there a possibility that these hard costs of the policy actions might make the administration go slow and take a realistic view of what's going to happen?
It's a really interesting question, because we don't have the guardrails that we have in Trump 2.0 that we had in Trump 1.0, which are the so-called adults in the room, the mainstream Republican thinkers that had some success in mitigating some of his more extreme trade and other policy positions. The only guardrail that I see in Trump 2.0, and it's a potentially very, very strong guardrail, are the financial markets. We know that he pays attention to the financial markets. We know that a number of major business executives have Trump's ear and are whispering in his ear about some of the negative fallout from these trade actions. So I think that it's certainly possible. Look, I don't see any possible way that the United States moves forward with the tariffs that they floated, and that we then see the predictable retaliation that major trading partners will eventually take. I don't see any scenario under which we can put these tariffs in place without having that filter through into higher inflation and potentially tripping some of the major economies into a recession. And I'll be honest with you, I have been surprised that he has been that forthcoming in sort of preparing the American people that there might be a little bit of pain, there might be some costs, there might be some transitions. That suggests to me that he's very serious about moving forward and does recognize the potential economic consequences of this.
Let's hope for once, Steve, that good sense will draw upon the Trump administration, in a hard and effective way, purposeful way. But thank you so much. We are so very grateful for your time and for sharing your wisdom on these subjects. Thank you so much, listeners. That was Stephen Olson, veteran trade policy commentator and currently visiting fellow at the Institute of Southeast Asian Studies, Yusof Ishak Institute. Thank you.
Thank you.
You are listening to South Asia Chat. You can learn more about our work by visiting us at isas.nus.edu.sg. You can also get updates on our research and publications through social media. You can find us on X, LinkedIn, Facebook, and Instagram.